Hello and welcome back. This is the week 8 lecture. So today I want to talk about our next major assignment, which is the literature review. I've already mentioned it. You can read the assignment details in the week 8 module in Canvas, but I just wanted to talk a little bit more about it today, how we should approach it, what our goals are, and how we can really start working on it here in week 8. I would like to get you ready to get moving on the assignment, and I did want to talk a little bit about due dates here because the due date I have posted in Canvas is March 23rd. So that's the end of week 8. If you feel ready to submit by the end of the week, you can certainly do that. However, next week is spring break for GBC. So class will not be in session after week 8. We take the following week off and we'll be back, I believe, the last day of March or the first day of April, something like that. So if you want to take that final week of March, GBC's spring break, if you want to take that time to work more on the assignment, that's also fine. You can wait until March 30th and submit at the end of spring break before we come back for what will be week 9. So you might realize that we have hit the halfway point of the semester. We have 16 weeks of instruction, and we are here in week 8. So this lit review kind of functions as our midterm. It is our second big assignment after the bibliography. When I say big assignment, I just mean something other than a research journal, which is kind of our small weekly assignment. So we've done the first half of our bibliography, and then we spent the last few weeks getting comfortable summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting. So now that we've developed those skills a little bit more, we can put them to use in the lit review. So let me just be really clear. The literature review assignment will require you to work with a few sources that you have found so far on your research topic. You will need at least 3 sources that you have found, and you can go up to 5. That is our range. You'll be discussing between 3 and 5 sources of your own. So these are not texts that I am providing, and these are not random things that you are going and looking for at the last minute. These should be sources that you have already found. And of course, all of these sources will be about your chosen research topic. So you can go back to the first half of your bibliography and grab a few sources that you have listed there. Also, if you found some more good sources since you turned in the bibliography, you can use some of those as well. It really doesn't matter when you found the sources or whether or not they show up on your bibliography. These just need to be sources that you are planning to use. These are sources that you think will be useful on your final research project, and you can always include them on your final bibliography. It's okay if they're not on the first half. You could always include them on the complete version that's due later in the semester. So hopefully you have enough sources to work with. If you don't have at least 3 good sources that you feel pretty confident that you will stick with, you need to do a little more research, find some more good sources before you tackle this assignment. So let me know if you have any questions as far as sources, due dates, or anything else that I've already mentioned. And again, read the assignment instructions in Canvas. And if there's anything there that doesn't make sense to you, just let me know. So before we jump into the details about the assignment, I wanted to talk a little bit about a new concept very much related to what we've been doing, but a little bit new. It might not be a brand new concept in general, but it might be a little bit new for us as far as thinking about it in an academic context. And I talk about this in the week 8 overview in Canvas. So we're talking about a concept known as synthesis. To synthesize something means to combine multiple ideas or viewpoints into a new product, into a new document, a new creation of your own. So we synthesize when we have a lot of information, when we have a lot of sources. We need to find ways to combine some of those sources, bring them together, find ways to talk about them together. This means looking for shared characteristics, shared traits, similarities that some of the sources might share, but we can also be looking at differences, things that make them stand apart. Some of these sources might be expressing opposing viewpoints, so we could definitely notice that. In other cases, we might have some sources that seem to agree with one another, or they seem to be making similar arguments. So by observing closely, by reading carefully, taking good notes, and using these summarizing and paraphrasing skills that we've been working on, we should find ways to synthesize. And this will be a little bit new for us, because up until now, all of our source work has been very individual. We've been looking at individual sources, right? We've been reading sources one at a time, summarizing them one at a time, right? Now we're starting to work with multiple sources at once. So we're not just summarizing one source. We're not just paraphrasing a paragraph from one source. Now we're juggling multiple sources, looking for ways to bring them together so we can talk about them together in a paper. Not just this paper, although of course that is what we'll be doing here, but also we need to be able to do this on our final research project. Because what you guys are going to realize is when we get to that big research paper, you're not going to have time to talk about each of your sources individually, one at a time. You won't have the space, you won't have the room to do that. It's really not practical. So it's fine in these early preliminary stages when our research is still in the early going. It's fine to kind of move through sources one at a time. But eventually, you have to start synthesizing them. In a paper like this, or a paper like the final research project, you can't move through those sources one by one. That would just take too long, and it would take up too much space. It would also take you too far away from the other things that you're supposed to be doing. So instead of moving through them so methodically and slowly, we sometimes want to be able to talk about multiple sources at the same time, in the same body paragraph. Perhaps we might want to talk about 2 or even 3 different sources in that paragraph. We can talk about similarities. If the sources are expressing opposing viewpoints, we can talk about how they're sort of on different sides of the debate. Maybe they're illustrating something important about the debate that we want to talk about more, or perhaps 2 of them are doing similar things that support our points, our argument that we're eventually making on the research project. So there's lots of different reasons why we might want to synthesize. Okay, but often it's just a matter of efficiency. It's a matter of making the best use of our space and time. And we just sometimes want to bring sources together for different reasons. So we can provide evidence, so we can provide different perspectives, so we can respond to stuff, so we can use some of this to support our own points. Whatever it is, synthesis is just a good skill to develop. And the literature review will help us to practice. It will help us to develop it so we get steadily better at doing this sort of thing. All right. So as we are synthesizing, we are also summarizing, paraphrasing, and occasionally providing direct quotations. So another thing the lit review allows you to do is sort of show me that you have a good handle on those skills, those things that we've been practicing for the last few weeks. So let's talk a little bit more about what a literature review is. This might be the first time you guys are doing this kind of an assignment. It's a fairly common assignment in English class, but normally college English class, maybe not as common at the lower levels. So this might be our first experience with a lit review. So I want you to think about it as a paper. Okay, it is a paper. It's not a super original paper because mostly you're just summarizing your sources and finding ways to synthesize them. But it's organized like a paper. It looks like a paper. And a really important concept to keep in mind is a lit review will be organized around ideas, not the sources themselves. So that's what makes the lit review different than, say, the annotated bibliography, right? The bibliography is very much organized around the individual sources. We are just listing the sources and providing citations and annotations for each one. That's it. The bibliography is not really a paper. It's something different. It looks different. It functions differently, right? But the lit review is a paper. So we're not going to have citations in the body of the paper. We're not going to have annotations. We're going to have complete sentences. We're going to have paragraphs. It's going to look like a more traditional paper. And like a paper, it's organized around ideas. It's not just a list of sources. So that means you're not just listing your sources and talking about them one by one. That's not what we want to do here. And we have to break the impulse to do that because it's very tempting to do that, to just move through one source at a time. Here's what this source is saying. Okay, here's the second source. That's what he's saying. Now the third source, she's saying something kind of similar, right? It's easy to do that. We've already been doing that. So our natural impulse might be to just keep doing it. Source 1, source 2, then I'll talk about source 3, then I'll talk about source 4 and maybe 5 at the end. But we're not doing that. That's not a successful organizational structure for this type of assignment. Also, and there's lots of problems with it. Also, it's boring to read a paper like that. Also, it's not good practice because, like I said, we're not going to have time either now or later on to talk about our sources one at a time. And also, if we do it like that, we are not synthesizing. We are not combining our sources and creating something new because that's an important part of synthesis. You're not just combining. You're not just talking about multiple sources at the same time. In the process of doing that, you're also creating something new. A lit review, something brand new, something that you wrote. So this is very similar to what we've been talking about with summarizing and paraphrasing. Right? When you're capturing the ideas of a source, it's not enough to just change a few of their words, right? You have to write brand new sentences. You have to change the structure of those ideas. You might present them in a slightly different order. You might write slightly longer or slightly shorter sentences expressing the same ideas, but you are building your own product, your own document, consisting of your own sentences, your own structure, your own vocabulary. It's the exact same idea with synthesis. When you combine the sources, you're not just quoting them at length. You're not just cutting and pasting what they say and putting it together with other sources, right? You're creating something new. That process of summarizing, paraphrasing, and synthesizing, it results in something new, a brand new paper written by you. The ideas aren't yours, but everything else is. The structure of the paper, the language of the paper, the organization of the paper, all yours, right? The way you're putting things, the way you're explaining things, that's all you. The ideas, the arguments, those, of course, come from the sources. So, since you know a lot about these sources, you should be able to tell us a lot. You should be able to find similarities and differences. But also, when we talk about organizing around ideas, that means you're looking for common themes, similar arguments, right? Common moves, common argumentative strategies, uses of evidence, things that will bring some of these sources together. You're looking for that stuff. You can talk about that stuff in the lit review. So we're looking for issues or themes, ideas, argumentative moves that can potentially connect some of your sources. And that's going to help you not only with this assignment, but again, with that big research project at the end of the semester. So let's talk a little bit about what your thesis statement will be in the lit review, because you will have a thesis. But unlike a lot of thesis statements we write for other papers, the thesis will not be an expression of your own argument, but rather a summary of the arguments being made in your sources. Okay, so again, this needs to be a brand new sentence or a couple of sentences written by you in your intro paragraph telling us what the sources are saying. What are their overall points? What would you say would be their overall arguments? What are they saying? This is a chance to also synthesize a little bit. You can identify some of your sources by name. By title, or you can use the author names. But you can say, you can create a sentence that combines a couple of different sentences based on the arguments they're making. If you think they're similar arguments, or if they are opposing arguments, and you want to show both sides of the debate, both sides of the issue or the controversy surrounding your topic. So you could write a sentence or a couple of sentences expressing, source A and source B are saying this, whereas my other two sources are doing that. Find a way to express that in a sentence or two, maybe even three of your own original sentences expressing what these sources are saying. So when you think about thesis, think about their thesis. It's not your original thesis statement. Instead, it's going to be a summary and a synthesis of the arguments being made in your sources. Okay? So that's important. We all need that in the lit review. So let's think a little bit about organization. Once you've identified a thesis, that's going to give focus to the lit review. That's going to show what your focus is, and that's going to be very helpful for your audience. Your readers, now they know what to expect. They know what you're going to be talking about. They know what you're going to be covering, what your basic sort of organizing principle or overall point is going to be. Right? So that's what the thesis does. It's a guidepost for the rest of the paper. It is telling your readers what's coming up, what we're going to be talking about, what we're going to be seeing. All right, so it needs to be clear, and that's why we like it near the end of the intro paragraph, so the reader is prepared for the body of your paper, the main part of your paper. So once you have that focus expressed clearly in your thesis, you need to start thinking more about how you're going to organize the rest of your paper. All right. Once you know the info that you want to present, and remember, all of this starts earlier with reading and taking notes and summarizing. So by the time you're sitting down to write your lit review, you've already read all of these sources. You've already underlined and annotated, taken notes, written brief summaries. Maybe some of that's in the bibliography. If not, you can write new summaries. So you already have all of that. You have notes. Like we've said, you've created that written record that you can go back to, you can go back and reference, you can go back and use when talking about these sources, because you're not going to be able to just remember everything off the top of your head. So when you're ready to start really moving on the assignment, pick an organizational structure. I'm going to give you guys a few options, a few ways to organize the body of your paper. But I want to start with a really basic structure that we will all follow. So this is not the optional part. This is what everybody should do. It's a very simple 3-part structure that every lit review follows. Okay? You have 3 basic parts. Number 1, an introduction to your sources. But also, you can think of it as an intro to your topic, because that's what your sources are allowing you to talk about. So the intro gives you a chance to literally introduce your sources. Tell us their titles or their author names or both. This is another way to do a little bit of synthesis, but you also need to write good, clear sentences. It's really easy to get sloppy when introducing sources when you have a lot of names, you have a lot of titles. Some of those titles might be long, and in some cases, you might have multiple author names. So you can imagine your sentence can get very long and very convoluted if you're trying to introduce 5 sources all together, all in the same sentence. That could end up being a very long and difficult to read sentence. So be careful, be clear. If you need to write multiple sentences to introduce these sources, that's fine. Okay? Do it in a way that's going to make sense for your readers. Also, try to provide a general sort of background or overview of what these sources are about. So kind of start after you've introduced them on the topic level. Okay? Talk a little bit just about, the topics they are addressing. And this is all, of course, centered around your own research topic, but there could be some variance with different sources, right? They might cover different angles of the topic. They might cover some related topics. You can tell us that. Just give us a brief sense of kind of what they're about, and then hit us with their arguments. Tell us what the different thesis statements are. You might be able to combine some. You might be able to create a contrast between a couple and another one. Whatever you want to do. That's going to be a synthesizing sentence that also serves as your thesis. Find a way to talk about multiple sources at once. Okay? And sort of lay out the basic arguments that they are making so your readers know. Once you've done those things, you are finished with the introductory section. So the intro should really just be your opening paragraph. You should be able to get all of that done in 1 paragraph, at most 2 paragraphs. If it takes you a long time to introduce your sources, or if it takes you a while to kind of get the topic expressed, and you want another paragraph to really get through the thesis statements, that's fine. Okay, but don't go beyond 2 paragraphs for your intro. And you can probably get everything comfortably into 1 paragraph if you are working somewhat efficiently. All right, so that's the intro. Pretty simple. Then we move into the body of the paper. So that contains your main discussion of the sources. This is where you're getting into their main points, their main uses of evidence, all the most important stuff from the sources, the stuff that you highlighted, the stuff that you wrote notes about, the stuff that you talked about in your summaries. Now you're talking about some of that stuff here. Also, in the body of your paper, this is your chance to do a lot of your summarizing, a lot of your paraphrasing, okay? And you can even sprinkle in a few direct quotations. But this is going to be the bulk of your paper, where you're discussing all of the sources that are featured in the paper. All right? So this is going to be at least 3 paragraphs. On the short end, and on the high end, maybe 5 up to 6 paragraphs for the body of the lit review. So this will be the majority. And then finally, the third section will be the conclusion, the way we wrap things up. This will be almost certainly just a single paragraph. Our conclusions are usually brief at the end of a lit review because, again, we're not really making our own argument. We're not spending a lot of time on our own stuff, so we can wrap up pretty quickly. But this is our chance. The conclusion is our only chance, really, to talk about ourselves. Okay, so I want to be clear. Up until the conclusion, you are totally focused on what your sources are saying. Okay? But once we get to the conclusion, you can do two things. You can tell your readers, mostly me, what you have learned so far from these sources. So discuss what you've learned, what you've discovered. Okay, and you can keep that pretty brief, maybe a couple of sentences. You might say a little bit more if you've learned a lot, but you can kind of summarize what you've learned. You don't have to go through every single item. You can just give us an overview of what this research experience has kind of been for you so far. And what have you learned from some of these good sources? And then finally, the last thing you can do in that concluding paragraph is what we call sort of a look ahead, anticipating what might be next for you. What might be next with your research? Where might you go from here? So again, building on what you've learned, building on what you've already sort of done and experienced so far, where do you think you're headed next? Is there a particular direction that you think your research might take? Are there certain questions that you're still looking for answers to? Do you want to learn more about a particular area? You can tell us that at the end. So this is a chance to kind of share just how research has gone, what you've learned, and what you think you're going to do next. So if you have a few general impressions or general opinions to share about some of the research that you've done, you can fit some of that into your conclusion. But keep it brief. Obviously, as we know at this point, our own viewpoints are not the focus. So we're really just trying to get a little bit more organized with our future research, with the conclusion, trying to create a record of what we've learned so far, and also trying to think about what we might do next. And that's it. Once we've written that concluding paragraph, we are finished. You will need a works cited page for this assignment. So every source that you've discussed, those 3 to 5 sources that you're talking about in the lit review, they all need to be listed on your works cited page. Now, we don't need annotations, we just need the citations. So if these are some of the same sources that appeared on your bibliography, and if you know, because I've told you that your citations on the bibliography were correct, then you can just cut and paste the citations into your new works cited page for the lit review. There's no reason to do them again if they are correct. And if they were nearly correct, you just had a couple of edits to make, and you've implemented those edits. Now the citation's correct. Now you can import it to this new works cited page. So don't feel like you have to do the citations all over again. And hopefully we have found some good online citation generators that can do a lot of the work for us. But of course, if your citations were a mess back on the bibliography, hopefully you fixed them by now so you're ready to plug them in to the works cited. And that's it. That's what the paper will look like. But let's talk a little bit more about organization, really focusing on the body. Because the intro and the conclusion, those are pretty easy to plan because they're probably just going to be single paragraphs. However, as we know, the body is going to be a lot longer, a lot more paragraphs. So how do we organize the paragraphs in our body? How do we organize all of our different sources? How do we put all of them together in those paragraphs in a way that's going to make sense for our readers? Well, we have some options when it comes to presenting the most important info from our sources. We have some different organizational methods that we can choose from. I will make some recommendations, but also you guys have freedom here to choose the method that works best for you. All right. And I'll run through these and then I'll talk about which one is probably the best. So the first method for organizing your body paragraphs is what we call chronological. And I think we know what this means. We're following a sort of sequential order from earliest to latest, right? Going from the thing that happened longest ago up to the thing that happened most recently. We can also reverse chronology if we want to, but generally this means we are proceeding along an organizational structure based on time, based on when your sources were published, when they appeared, when they were talked about, but mostly based on publication dates, when they were published. This can work. This really only works if time is really, really important to your topic. Uh, I have seen this work before, but it's a little bit tricky. This is only a good organizational method for you if your topic that you're talking about here in the lit review really does proceed in this sort of clear, sequential, historical timeline. And if the timeline itself is really important to your topic. So if things have been happening or accelerating in recent years and you have some recent stuff published that kind of expresses where we are now, and then you have some stuff published 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago that sort of shows where the topic was then, and you very much are interested in how things have changed over the last 20 years, and you can kind of show that through a chronological review of your sources, that could work, right? If time really matters for your topic. This is often true of kind of like newer topics, like topics that have really only been around or have only been discussed or argued about for maybe the last few years or the last decade. This might surround recent technology, recent innovations, things that have happened fairly recently. So if that sounds like your topic, if things have been happening, a lot of new developments, and you can kind of track that or show that by talking about your sources in the order of when they were published, that could work. That could be an organizational structure that would allow you to do some good stuff. Not only does it help you organize the sources, but you're showing what's changed or what's happened over this timeline. So if the timeline matters for your topic, you might consider a chronological organization. That's option one. Option number two, you could talk about the different publications. This would be, again, this can be sort of based on chronology if you're going in the order that stuff was published. But you could also talk about academic sources compared to popular sources. We've talked about this distinction before. Academic sources tend to show up in academic journals or EDU websites or maybe scholarly books. A lot of these sources will be peer reviewed. Certainly any article from an academic journal will be, which means it's been vetted by other experts. It's been reviewed before it was published. So we might want to set up a distinction between our academic sources and more popular sources that show up in newspapers or popular sort of news magazines or even videos, movies, TV are generally thought of as more popular sources, stuff that might be on certain kinds of websites. So you could do that, really sort of organize your discussion of the sources around what types of publications they are. Are they academic? Are they coming from journals? Are they coming from newspapers? Are they videos that we found on YouTube? So you can use the different kinds of sources, the different places they come from, to be an organizing strategy or an organizing principle. But again, this can also be very much just chronology. You can be thinking about the publication dates when the articles came out. All right. So that's kind of one big option with a couple of different flavors. You can also look for trends or developments in how people talk about the topic. All right. So again, if your different sources can kind of illustrate the evolution of the debate, or if they illustrate sort of new trends in the topic that exists now, but didn't exist in previous times, you can use trends or developments as a way to organize your sources. So you can talk about some of the older developments that were talked about 10 years ago, and then you can talk about new trends talked about in news sources that are more recent, and you can organize based on those ideas, the new developments, the new things that are happening. But like all of these, this only works for some topics in certain situations and for certain sources, right? So to do your organization based on trend, you need to have some clear differences between your sources. The sources have to really show change. They have to illustrate how the conversation or the debate around your topic has changed. So if you have a lot of sources that are rather similar and they're talking about similar things in similar ways, you might not be able to do the trend method because the sources aren't showing different trends. They're not showing different developments. They might just be showing one. And you could talk about that, but you wouldn't want to organize it all around trend if there's just one trend. But if you can identify multiple trends, multiple developments, different changes happening within your topic, and your sources show that, then you can definitely use that to organize your sources. Those are all options, and sometimes those work well, but they're very situational. They're very dependent on topic and source and sources. The last method works every time. It works for everybody. It works regardless of your topic, regardless of what sources you're looking at. So this final option is the best option, and it's the one that I would recommend the most. Organizing around theme. So we call this the thematic organizational method. And this just means that you are organizing based around the larger meaning or themes at work in the sources you are talking about. So you can really think about this as organizing around their arguments, organizing based on their thesis statements, at least your recreation of their thesis statements. Okay? This is the tried and true way. It works all the time, and it's a good way to ensure that you're thinking more about the larger arguments that your sources are making. So with this method, you're not really worried about chronology. You're not worried about when the sources were published or where they were published. You don't really care about that stuff. You're just focused on their ideas, right? And you can find similarities or differences in those ideas that will help you to organize, help you to synthesize. But remember, the most important ideas of these sources will be their overall points or their overall arguments. So we can consider those to be the themes of the sources. Just like a short story or a novel has a theme, that larger meaning that the author is trying to get across, we can imagine that all of our sources have themes. Larger meaning, larger point, larger argument, however we want to think about it, but it's a theme. It's the main takeaway they want you, the reader, to have when you finished reading that source. So you can organize based on theme, and that really is the best way. Organizing based on what the sources are saying and what they mean. That's the most important stuff anyway, so it's a great way to organize. All right, so let me know if you have any questions about those different organizational structures, or if you want to ask me if one might work for you. Like I said, with the chronology, with the trend, or with the different types of sources, those can work, but only if those things that you're observing really matter to you. Only if the trends matter. Only if the timeline matters. Only if the differences between the sources, like academic versus popular, matter. If that stuff matters to you, then that's part of your focus. That's part of the focus of your lit review. So you could do that. But if that stuff doesn't really matter, or if it's not super important for your topic, might not work. The thematic approach always works. But feel free to ask me if you want to try something different. All right, and sometimes we have to do a few other things in our lit review just to provide all the necessary info and to make sure that we're explaining everything that we need to explain. So these are some other sections that you might have to include in the body of your lit review. These are other things that you might need to do in some of your body paragraphs, okay? And in some cases, you might already be doing some of this based on some of your organizational methods and some of your summarizing and paraphrasing. But one thing that's often useful to do in the body of a lit review is to kind of describe the current situation surrounding your topic so your readers understand, right? What is going on right now, especially if that's sort of what the sources are speaking to. What's going on? Where are we right now? You can sort of orient us. Again, summarizing is a big part of this. Taking a bunch of different developments, maybe this is a timeline, this might matter when it comes to chronology, but you're taking a bunch of events, a bunch of things that have happened, sort of shrinking them down, and then giving us a succinct description of the present day moment. What's led up to this? Where are we now? What is the present situation? Sometimes you might want to talk about that. In other cases, you might not think it's as important, or it might have already been made clear earlier. But at some point in your body section, you might want to explain or describe the current situation with your topic. Another thing you can always do is provide historical background, a chronological progression of your topic, what's happened, what's changed, and kind of, again, lead us up to the present moment. It's up to you how much of a historical background you want to provide. You have to make decisions, based on your topic and based on what you think your readers already know about your topic compared to what they don't know. All right, so if this is a topic that a lot of people are not familiar with, and they're not going to be very familiar with a lot of the ideas discussed in your sources, then a good bit of historical background could be useful. Might even be nice as one of your early body paragraphs. Tell us about the topic. Fill us in. Give us some important info that's kind of already happened so we understand better what's happening now. But if your topic's a little bit better understood, if it's not super obscure or specific to just one academic field, you might be able to assume a little bit more knowledge on the part of your readers. And you might not have to provide as much history. But remember, anytime you're giving us a rundown of historical background, you are always summarizing. You're not giving us every single historical fact. You're summarizing, you're condensing, you're shrinking it down into a much more manageable shape. So this might be a paragraph, this might just be a few sentences. And then finally, thinking a little bit more about what we call methodology. When we're talking about research in academia, we often think about different methods. And this really kind of pertains to sources, different methods that we use to find sources, and also the different methods that the authors are using in these sources. So again, we can talk about, peer-reviewed articles versus other types of sources. We can even talk about the criteria that we used to select sources. What were we looking for in our sources? What kinds of sources are these? Again, that might be an organizing principle for you. It could also be something you talk about just briefly in one of your body paragraphs if you think it's important. If there's an important distinction between what different types of sources are doing or how they're approaching your topic. If it matters, you can talk about it in the body of your paper. If it doesn't really matter that much, if there's not huge differences between the different types of sources, then that's not something you would really worry about. So, a lot of choices to make when it comes to organization. Make your choices specific to your topic, your sources, and the focus of your lit review. All right, there's not a one size fits all approach to these papers. It's always going to be based on your topic and the sources that you're working with. All right, so just a few tips, ways to get started, and also let's think a little bit about the writing process. Something that I talked about a lot in 101. You might remember if you took my 101 class back in the fall. But for any major assignment, we need to approach it as a process. For any major English assignment, when it comes to writing, we want to break this stuff down into different steps, right? Separate stages that we can tackle at different times. And if we follow all the necessary steps, we end up at a good final destination. But you don't want to try to do all of this at once, right? That's why I've had you summarizing and paraphrasing sources for the last few weeks. Hopefully you have a good body of knowledge by now, and you've created some of these good written records with your notes and your summaries. So that's always where we start the process. Reading, at least with a paper like this, if we're doing source work, we always start by reading, underlining, annotating, summarizing, and then we have an idea of what we're doing. So hopefully, once you've selected your sources, you can do some brainstorming that will allow you to do some early synthesis, to identify the arguments being made, and to start getting some of that stuff written down. So once you have a sense of your focus in the lit review, the arguments you're going to be discussing, the sources you're talking about, you can start going through our early steps to begin composing the paper. All right. So pick an organizational method, one of the options I've just listed. You have a sense of your thesis. You've already picked the sources. Now we can start writing. A thing to look for, a thing to definitely take notes on, and a thing to definitely discuss in your bodies. Just remember, evidence. We need to talk about evidence. Artistic appeals. Inartistic appeals, okay? You need to discuss those as you see them working in your sources. So again, you're not expressing opinions about the appeals. You're simply paraphrasing some examples of evidence that seem important, or you're summarizing some different types of evidence that the author might be using to make their arguments. All right? So look for evidence, be ready to talk about evidence in your body paragraphs. That should just be part of your standard summarizing and paraphrasing moves. Also, be selective. Remember our basic summarizing principle. We can't cover everything. So we're only hitting the most important ideas, the most important statements, the stuff that we think is most essential. But remember, we also mentioned with summary that you always pick a focus, right? The way that I summarize a particular article would not be the same way that you summarize that article, because I might be focusing on something a little bit different. The focus is really always your choice. What's most important to you? It might be a little bit different than what's most important to me or some other reader. So the focus really comes from you. And all the information you provide, the organizational structure that you provide, all of that should be based on your focus in the lit review, what you think is most important. Okay? And that in turn reflects what you think is most important in the sources, right? What's most important in these different articles or books or websites that you found so far. Also, we do have some room to quote, but I want us to use our direct quotations sparingly. All right? I have a quote here from somebody else about lit reviews. The nature of the literature review, they say, does not allow for super in-depth discussion or detailed quotes from the text. We just don't have enough space. We're covering a lot of different sources. We are synthesizing. We are summarizing. We're covering a lot of ground. Sometimes we're moving somewhat fast. So that means we don't really have a chance for a lot of long quotations. I don't want lengthy quotations in this paper. And I certainly don't want any quotations longer than 4 lines. Okay, those are called block quotes. Any quote that goes beyond 4 lines in a standard form, a basically formatted, double-spaced Word doc, any quote that's beyond 4 lines in that format is a block quote, and it has to be formatted differently. And I really don't want block quotes at this stage of the game. You can include some on your final research project if you want, but here we just don't want them. Okay? We're not going to use long quotes as a crutch. We have to deal with these ideas ourselves. We have to use our own language. So if you're going to quote, okay, you have a number that you can reach. You can have up to 3 direct quotations, but they all need to be a single sentence long or shorter. They don't even have to be a full sentence, and they can be up to 1 full sentence. That's it. I don't want multiple sentences. I don't want a paragraph, certainly. I don't want long quotes. It's just an easy way to avoid doing the kind of work that we're actually doing, right? There's a time to do more quoting later. Right now, I really want the focus to be on summarizing and paraphrasing. But just like we did on the last research journal, in the midst of paraphrasing, we can sometimes do a direct quote. Or in the midst of a longer summary, we can insert a brief direct quote. That's okay. If you think the author is saying something in a powerful and memorable way, if you think they are saying it in a way that's better than you could say it, if you think it sounds better in its current form, in its original form, than it would sound rewritten by you, then okay, quote it, but make sure it's no longer than 1 sentence. And you can have 3 of those throughout the paper, up to 3, no more than 3. All right. And just remember, we are summarizing and synthesizing. We are doing that. We are doing both, and paraphrasing. We are doing all of that within individual paragraphs. And then we're just doing all of that throughout the entire paper, and certainly throughout the entire body section. That whole middle section, all of our body paragraphs. That's where we're combining our sources. So again, don't go through the sources one by one in your bodies. I want you to talk about multiple sources in at least some of your body paragraphs. That's how you're showing me that you can synthesize. Find ways to bring these sources together. Again, based on some of those organizational methods that I mentioned, or key similarities and differences that you're noticing in the sources. All right. Also, another key thing to remember, keep your own voice, use your own language. I know I've said it a lot, but it's easy to forget. It's easy to slip up when you're doing this kind of work. It's easy, like I've said before, to get caught between paraphrasing and quoting. It's not quite a direct quote because you've changed a few words, but it's not really a good paraphrase either because you haven't changed enough. You haven't changed the sentence structure. You haven't changed the way you're phrasing things, the way you're organizing some of the info. It's all very much the same as it was in the original source. So yeah, you have a few synonyms, but that's not enough to really have a new paraphrase of your own, Remember, you're creating something new. That's what we do when we synthesize. That's what we do when we summarize and paraphrase. So that means you have to write new sentences and they have to be in your voice. That means don't recycle the tone or the terminology or just the overall language of the authors of your sources. They don't sound like you. They don't talk like you. They don't write like you. They don't think like you. So you're capturing their ideas, but the way you do it is yours, right? The way you do it should be original and unique to you. That means a sentence of your own, written in the structure and the phrasing that you prefer, using words that you would use, and arranged in a way that you would arrange that info. That's how you paraphrase. And that's how you make sure that Turnitin does not hassle you when you submit your paper. Because as I've tried to say, if you guys are just changing a few individual words, you will have problems with Turnitin because the language is still the author's. It's not yours. Okay? So keep your voice. And use all of those methods and strategies that we've been talking about with all of our summary and paraphrase stuff. And then finally, revise. Once you have finished a draft, let's get back into process for a moment. Because again, this isn't going to all happen in one day. It's not all going to happen in one night. Once you've done all the preliminary stuff, you're ready to write. Once you've written, you really want to focus on creating a completed rough draft. Okay, meeting my length requirement, including the appropriate number of paragraphs, making sure that you've covered all three of our sections, the intro, the body, and the conclusion. Once you have a finished draft, don't submit it right away. Okay, you're not finished. The process is not finished. You just have a rough draft. That initial finished draft is always a rough draft. You might not call it that. You might want it to be a final draft, but it's not final. Okay, it's not a final draft until you have revised and edited. All right. And this is a process, even for professional writers. That initial draft that they produce is not the one that gets published. That's not the one that gets accepted. That initial draft gets marked up by their editor, right? And it gets sent back to the professional author, and they have directions for revising and editing, and they have to make the draft better, resubmit it, and then it might get published. That's true with academic publishing. That's true with popular publishing. That's just the way it goes. For any writing that's later going to be published, there's always going to be multiple drafts. A rough draft followed by probably another slightly less rough draft, maybe another draft, and then eventually a final draft. Now, we might not have time for all of that, but we need at least 2 separate drafts. We have our rough draft. We finish that, hopefully with a few days left before the deadline. If so, take a break. Once you have that completed draft, take a break from the assignment, if possible. Again, hopefully you have a day or 2 left before you have to submit your final draft. So take a break, get away from the assignment, do other stuff, and then come back when you're a little bit fresh. Maybe the next day, maybe just a few hours later, whatever you can afford. But come back fresh, and then you can do what's called post-writing. Right? The writing process really gets broken down into 3 basic stages. Pre-writing is everything you do before you start writing. So that would be reading our sources, taking notes, jotting down a summary, and even creating an outline. You know, we saw a few weeks ago how we can outline a summary really by just organizing our best notes, the best things that we've observed, the most important things that we've observed and underlined from our sources. And then we can kind of arrange those notes. We know what we're going to talk about. Now we've organized our summary and we can just fill it in. You can do a similar kind of outline for this paper. That's part of pre-writing, right? Once you know the sources that you're going to write about, once you've summarized all of them and identified their arguments, you can sort of plan out what you're going to do in each paragraph because you know the paragraphs that you need. You have an intro paragraph. You can plan for that. You know you need at least 3 body paragraphs, maybe as many as 5 or 6. So you can go ahead and plan those. And then you can plan your concluding paragraph. I love outlines. I'm a big believer in outlines. And in 101, I make my students submit outlines. We're going to do some outlining, some required outlining later. But for this paper, I really recommend having at least a rough sketch of an outline somewhere in your notes, somewhere where you can use it. Just a basic plan of what your paper is going to look like, how you're going to organize it, and really any good outline is going to be a plan for each individual paragraph. So as you're outlining, think about the paragraphs I'm telling you to write, and then also think about the different organizational methods that you can use to put those paragraphs together. All right. And once you have that plan, that outline, the next step, writing, composing, that's when you're actually sitting down and putting together your rough draft. So hopefully by the end of this week, we are all ready to start drafting. And then once you've drafted, again, you have a rough draft and you're ready to enter the final stage of the writing process, which is post-writing. That's everything you do after you've written a completed draft. So post-writing mostly means revising and editing. Revising means you are making improvements to anything in your paper that's not quite working in the rough draft. So there's really no rules with revision. There's different levels of revision. You can do sentence level revision. You can think more about entire paragraphs. You can make changes to paragraphs with paragraph level revision. And then you can do more big picture revision. Is my thesis clear? Remember, your thesis being a summary of the arguments being made in your sources. Am I using a successful organizational method? Do my paragraphs appear in the order that I want them to be in? Do I want to reorganize paragraphs? Do I want to rewrite or revise some individual sentences? You might find some sentences that aren't clear. You know what you're trying to say, but your readers probably won't know. So you don't have to always rewrite those sentences completely from scratch. You might just want to make a few tweaks to those sentences. Take a word out, add a word, rearrange the order of the sentence. Or if the sentence is just bad, maybe you want to get rid of it and write a new one, a better one, in its place. These are just the basic steps we take when we revise, making decisions about what we can improve. Sentence level, paragraph level, and an even bigger level about the overall purpose and focus of the paper. Are we doing everything that we set out to do? But also, when you're revising, check your language. Make sure your paraphrases and your summaries are written by you. Double check in-text citations. We need in-text citations in this paper and with future papers that involve our sources, involve research. So make sure our citations are correct. Make sure we have a good overall level of clarity and efficiency. Just make sure the paper works the way you want it to work. That's really all revision is. It's just making those kinds of improvements. And doing that kind of work is often what takes a rough draft and makes it into a final draft. But the last step you can take before you submit is editing. So that's another good way to turn your rough draft into a more polished final draft. Once you have revised, you need to go through the draft and edit. That means you are looking for mistakes, typos, grammatical errors, anything that needs to be cleaned up, missing quotation marks. That happens a lot. Maybe missing a citation, cleaning something up on the works cited page. Also, formatting. Make sure the whole document's double spaced. Make sure you have a heading. Again, this is a paper. It should look like an English paper. Heading on page 1 in the upper left-hand corner. Page numbers in the upper right-hand corner. A title provided by you, an original title for this paper. Paragraphs that always have their first line indented. A works cited page as the final page of the document. Double check, make sure everything looks good, make sure you've caught as many errors as possible before you submit. And once you've done those final revising and editing steps, now you have a final draft. Now it's time to submit. All right. So if you guys have any questions about the assignment, let me know. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'm happy to look at a rough draft. So if you want me to help out or just tell you how you're doing, send me a rough draft before our deadline, at least a few days before. Usually my rule is if something's due on a Sunday, I need to see your rough draft by Friday at 5 p.m. Sort of the end of the work week. Give me a couple of days before the final deadline, and I'll give you some feedback so you can then revise and edit. All right, I'm always happy to do that for any major assignment. You don't have to ask. You can just send me your rough draft. But email it to me. Don't upload it to Canvas because there is no assignment link for a lit review rough draft. Okay, so if you want me to look at it, email it to me and then wait until you have a final draft, and that's what you submit in Canvas. All right, so good luck. I will not see you guys next week. We're taking that week off for spring break, so I will see you in 2 weeks when we come back for week 9.